We all know that history has a way of surprising us. But what if I told you that some of the oldest written records ever discovered don't just tell us about the past? They challenge everything we thought we knew about ancient civilizations. Laws written before nations existed, medical knowledge that rivals modern textbooks, royal histories carved into stone before paper was even invented. Doesn't make sense, does it? How could people thousands of years ago think at that level? Yet the evidence exists, sitting in museums, preserved in deserts, locked inside crumbling papyrus scrolls. There are tablets etched with legal codes, stones covered in royal records, stretching back to the very birth of Egypt. Medical texts describing surgeries we still perform today. Today, we are uncovering 4 of the most extraordinary ancient documents ever found, and the secrets they carry about a world far more advanced than we ever imagined. The Law Code of Ur-Nammu, around 2100 BC, in the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq. A king named Ur-Nammu did something no ruler before him had ever done. He wrote down the rules, not suggestions, not oral traditions passed from elder to elder, actual laws, structured, numbered, deliberate laws inscribed into clay tablets for all the kingdom to know and follow. When archaeologists first uncovered fragments of these tablets in the 20th century, they initially paid them little attention. Broken clay was common in the region, but as scholars began cleaning, piecing, and translating the ancient Sumerian text, they realized what they were holding: the oldest known law code in all of human history. What made the discovery even more extraordinary was not just its age. It was its sophistication. The Law Code of Ur-Nammu did not simply punish, it reasoned. It set fines for causing bodily injury. It protected widows and orphans from the powerful. It established standards for weights and measures to prevent merchants from cheating customers. It even addressed the treatment of slaves with a degree of nuance that scholars found astonishing. Here was a civilization over 4,000 years old, grappling with the same problems of fairness and order that still fill courtrooms today. How did a society operating without computers, without printing presses, without any of the institutions we take for granted, arrive at such a structured understanding of justice? The tablets sat in the dust of the earth for millennia, waiting to ask that question. Researchers who studied the code noted something else that deepened the mystery. The prologue. Before listing a single law, Ur-Nammu declared that he had established equity in the land and abolished corruption. He was not merely writing rules, he was making a philosophical statement. He understood that laws without moral foundation were meaningless, that a code needed a conscience. Scholars debated for years whether this reflected the king's own thinking or the collective wisdom of an entire civilization. Either way, the implications were staggering. Legal philosophy, it turns out, is not a modern invention. It was carved into clay long before Rome existed, long before Greece rose to prominence, long before the very concept of a nation-state had formed. Some fragments of the tablets remain missing to this day. Entire laws have been lost to time, swallowed by the ancient soil. What survives is only a portion of what Ur-Nammu once proclaimed, and yet even that fragment is enough to make historians pause, enough to ask whether the road to civilization was far longer, far more deliberate, and far more human than anyone ever expected. In the early days of Egyptology, when scholars were racing to decode hieroglyphics and map the tombs of pharaohs, a large black basalt stone was discovered, bearing an inscription unlike anything previously catalogued. It was not a poem, it was not a prayer, it was a list. A meticulous, column-by-column list of Egyptian kings, stretching back to a time before memory, before flood, before recorded human history. The stone was named the Palermo Stone, after the Sicilian museum where the largest surviving fragment eventually came to rest. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered, because the stone was already ancient when Egypt was already ancient. Whoever carved it was looking backward across an expanse of time so vast, it seemed mythological. The Palermo Stone is thought to date from the 5th dynasty of Egypt, around 2400 BC. But the records it contains reach back far further, listing kings from before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, rulers whose names appear nowhere else in any surviving text. Scholars examining the stone notice that for each year of each reign, the inscription recorded major events: the height of the annual Nile flood, the construction of temples, the fashioning of divine statues, military campaigns. The stone was not simply a king list, it was an annals record, a year-by-year chronicle of royal Egypt, stretching across centuries, carved into a single slab of polished basalt with breathtaking precision. What troubled researchers was the condition of the stone. It had been broken. The surviving fragments, housed across multiple museums in Cairo, Palermo, and London, are only pieces of what was once a far larger monument. Whoever broke it, and historians still debate whether it was deliberate or accidental, destroyed an irreplaceable portion of ancient history. Names of kings vanished. Years of records dissolved. The gaps left behind have fueled a century of scholarly debate, with Egyptologists attempting to reconstruct the missing sections through cross-referencing other king lists, tomb inscriptions, and papyrus documents. Every reconstruction is partial. Every reconstruction is disputed. The deeper mystery of the Palermo Stone is not simply what it contains but what it implies. The Egyptians who carved it believed they were recording a history that extended back to divine rulers, to gods who walked among men and governed the land before mortal kings took the throne. Modern scholars read those entries with caution. Mythological, they say. But the sheer organizational sophistication required to compile such a record, to track floods, festivals, and military events across hundreds of years, suggests a bureaucratic infrastructure so advanced that even skeptics are forced to admire it. Egypt was not improvising, Egypt was filing records, and someone at some point decided those records were worth carving in stone forever. The Edwin Smith Papyrus. In 1862, an American dealer named Edwin Smith purchased a papyrus scroll in Luxor, Egypt. He could not have fully understood what he was holding. Yellowed and fragile, was covered in a form of ancient Egyptian writing known as hieratic script, a cursive version of hieroglyphics used by scribes for everyday administrative and literary purposes. Smith spent years attempting to translate it without success. It was not until after his death, when the scroll passed to the New York Historical Society and eventually came into the hands of the scholar James Henry Breasted in the 1920s, that its true nature was finally revealed. What Edwin Smith had carried home from Luxor was the oldest known surgical text in human history. The Edwin Smith Papyrus dates to approximately 1600 BC, but is believed to be a copy of an even older source, potentially from as early as 3000 BC, making the medical knowledge it contains almost impossibly ancient. The document describes 48 cases of injury and disease, each laid out in a format so methodical, it resembles a modern clinical manual. For each case, there is a title identifying the type of injury, an examination describing the symptoms in precise terms, a diagnosis assessing whether the case was treatable, possibly treatable, or beyond treatment, a treatment plan with specific instructions. The structure was so systematic that when Breasted completed his translation, he reportedly stared at the text for long minutes, uncertain whether to feel awe or disbelief. What the papyrus described was startling. The ancient Egyptian physicians who produced it understood the brain and its function in ways that bear no resemblance to the magical thinking historians had long assumed dominated ancient medicine. One case describes the examination of a patient with a fractured skull and records observations about the pulsations of the exposed brain surface. It notes the relationship between brain injury and paralysis of limbs on the opposite side of the body. Contralateral deficit, the crossing of neurological signals from one side of the brain to the other, is a concept taught in medical schools today. It was apparently understood along the Nile over 3,000 years ago. The physicians even had a word for the brain. It appears here in this scroll for the very first time in any known written language. Researchers who studied the papyrus noted that its approach was almost aggressively rational. There were no spells, no incantations to drive out demons. In 48 cases dealing with some of the most severe injuries imaginable, the text relies entirely on observation, physical examination, and practical intervention. It was not until the final section of the scroll, where the injuries became clearly fatal and beyond any treatment, that magical remedies began to appear. Even then, they were almost apologetic, as if the scribes themselves recognized that they were stepping outside the bounds of what medicine could actually do. The boundary between science and superstition had apparently been understood and deliberately managed, 4,000 years before the invention of modern medicine. The Ebers Papyrus, approximately 15 years after Edwin Smith purchased his scroll in Luxor, another remarkable papyrus emerged from the same city. A German Egyptologist named Georg Ebers acquired it in 1873, and the document that now carries his name proved to be something altogether different from the surgical text Smith had found. Where the Edwin Smith Papyrus was methodical and anatomical, the Ebers Papyrus was vast and encyclopedic. At over 20 meters in length, it remains one of the longest and most comprehensive medical documents to survive from antiquity. And its subject was not surgery. It was everything else. The Ebers Papyrus dates to approximately 1550 BC and contains over 800 remedies for conditions ranging from stomach ailments and skin diseases to heart problems, dental pain, and depression. It describes the preparation of medicines using hundreds of different ingredients, including plants, minerals, and animal products. Some of the herbs listed, aloe, willow bark, castor oil, appear today in modern pharmacology under different names, but for strikingly similar purposes. Willow bark contains salicin, the natural compound from which aspirin was eventually synthesized. Ancient Egyptians were applying it to reduce fever and inflammation thousands of years before a German chemist formally isolated its active ingredient. What made the discovery genuinely disorienting for the scientists and historians who examined the papyrus in detail was the level of botanical knowledge it demonstrated. The Egyptians who compiled the Ebers Papyrus had clearly spent generations observing, testing, and cataloging the effects of plants on the human body. They understood dose, they understood preparation, they knew that the same plant could be therapeutic in small amounts and harmful in large ones. They knew that certain ingredients needed to be combined, that some medicines worked better when consumed and others when applied to the skin. This was not folk wisdom guessed at around a fire. This was the product of a medical tradition so old, so practiced, and so carefully documented that it had developed its own internal logic, long before the Greeks, the Romans, or any civilization we typically credit with founding Western medicine. The papyrus also contained something unexpected, a section on the heart that describes the pulse and what it might indicate about a patient's condition. It states with remarkable clarity that the heart speaks through the vessels to every limb of the body. Circulation. Not understood in the Western medical tradition until William Harvey described it in 1628. The Ebers Papyrus was gesturing toward it in 1550 BC. Scholars have debated exactly how complete and accurate the ancient understanding was, whether it was genuine physiological insight or a poetic metaphor that happened to be correct. But the debate itself is the point. A medical text from nearly 4,000 years ago is sophisticated enough that modern researchers cannot simply dismiss it. It demands to be taken seriously. And in that demand, it carries a message far larger than any individual remedy it contains. It tells us that the story of human knowledge does not begin where we thought it did. It reaches back further, deeper, and stranger than we have ever been comfortable admitting. These 4 documents, a tablet of laws, a stone of Royal Annals, a surgical manual, and an herbal encyclopedia, were not created by primitive minds struggling towards civilization. They were created by people who had already arrived there, who had built systems of justice, record-keeping, medicine, and science that worked, who had thought carefully, documented rigorously, and passed their knowledge forward across centuries. The clay crumbled, the papyrus yellowed, the basalt cracked, but the ideas survived. And when we finally read them, we discovered not the distant beginnings of human thought, but its deep and ancient roots.